just want to think into these ideas to do with consciousness, free will, and the idea of the self. Just watched a couple of videos, one by Piro 314, one by the Modern Mystic, and there's a lot of videos I have to catch up on. But these videos are about consciousness and free will, and I'm trying to bring the self into this. And I'm particularly interested in avoiding generalized definitions of consciousness and generalized definitions of free will, and use a non-generalized definition of consciousness to probe what the idea of free will might be, using the concept of the self. I'll just explain what I mean by a non-generalized definition of consciousness, because it's often used by myself and many other people, I think, in a way which is really incoherent. It's a useful term if you're talking generally, but when you're talking specifics, it kind of breaks down, and it leads to what I think are incoherent statements about things being conscious, which claims shouldn't be made, and misunderstandings, and I think that's unfortunate. So I'm using a very specific model of consciousness, and it's one that I think Dan Dennett came up with, but I might be wrong on that. Certainly Susan Blackmore talks about it in one of her books, and it's an idea of consciousness which is as an illusion, and it means something very specific by that. When Susan Blackmore talks about it, she says it's an illusion not because it doesn't exist, but because it doesn't exist in the way we think it exists. We think it exists as a certain kinds of thing, but that appearance is a chimera, is an illusion. It's something else. And what she says, based, I think, coming out of Daniel Dennett, and I'm not sure about that, is that consciousness is really only there when you look at it, kind of, or at least it's only coherent and singular when you look at it. Prior to that point, it's a whole set of parallel processes, perceptual process, memory processes, body monitoring processes, body maintenance processes, social, linguistic process, all sets of processes, partly involving the body, partly involving the upper regions of the brain, partly involving the emotional parts of the brain, involving the brain stem, other parts of the central nervous system. So it's a whole sets of processes which are, I'm kind of seeing as kind of data streams. Lots and lots of parallel data streams being simultaneously processed and built into feedback loops and so on. And there's nothing inherently coherent or inherently singular about this. It's multiple sets of information that are passing through us at any one moment. However, in addition to those multiple data streams, we also have this thing called the self. And here I'm borrowing from Damasio's idea of the self, but also a little bit of Thomas Metzinger's idea of the self, which is that the self, the proto-self in Damasio, is a set of stable processes that are, or maps really, of bodily processes formed in the brainstem. So the brainstem, which is a really old part of the brain, just at the top of it's where your body joins your brain, effectively. The top of the spinal column, where it goes into the brain, but before it hits the cerebellum or the basal ganglia, and certainly long before it hits the frontal cortex. It's this very old set of processes which are taking up, set of structures, I beg your pardon, which are taking up information from the body and mapping them and comparing them to existing maps that it's got. It builds in there maps of what, how your body is arranged in space. So I can close my eyes, but I still know where my arms are. I can do that because I've got a map, a representation in there, dynamically being updated constantly. Similarly with the internal milieu of my body and all kinds of different things. So there's lots of different maps held in there, and those maps for Damasio are the proto-self. They're the kind of data stream, if you like, which has a singular function in the way that a map has a singular function. It doesn't cohere information in a way which gives it a unique identity, but it coheres it in a way that makes it usable. But then what Susan Blackmore goes on to say, she doesn't use the concept of self, I'm kind of borrowing elsewhere for that, but she says that this feeling of a consistent consciousness, this feeling that the stream of consciousness, as James puts it, this feeling that we are walking a single path, a path which we may at some point make decisions about which one to walk down, this feeling that we have got a single stream of perceptions and memories and feelings going through us at all times. She says that's the illusion, and it's illusion brought about by a probing of those multiple parallel data streams by a single sort of search function which I'm identifying with the self. So we have this thing called a self, which is just a a routine function. It's not a homunculus, it's not an executive function, it's none of those kind of things. It doesn't have any kind of personality or a separate consciousness or any of those things. It's just a function, a subroutine, if you like. But the self model probes the multiple data streams, and out of that, almost like searching a database, but sends probes into these multiple data streams and coheres the results of those search terms, results of that probe, to form a kind of autobiography, what again Damasio would call the autobiographical self, which just kind of wraps around and becomes part of and associated with the proto-self. So we start to get not only a proto-self or a core self, but also an autobiographical self. But it's not because only one thing has happened to us, it's because our probing of those multiple data streams, the multiple perceptions that we're having, the multiple memories and feelings that we have, that probing draws out a single strand, almost like, you know, dipping a glass rod into certain chemicals will bring up a single strand. It's that kind of a process, and it's that feeling of that our past has been a single strand, and that our present moment is a single existence. Susan Blackmore invites you to think, keep asking this question, you know, am I conscious now? Am I conscious now? Am I conscious now? And it's a great exercise to do if you keep doing it over a period of days, because you start to question, well, actually, am I really conscious now? Was I really conscious 10 minutes ago when I asked that question last time? What is my consciousness of 10 minutes ago? You know, what is my consciousness now of that consciousness then? It invites you to ask all those kind of questions. And what you start to realise, I think, doing that kind of exercise, is that it isn't nearly as singular and nearly as coherent as we think it is. It is much more like a set of search terms carried out on an elaborate database, representing lots of parallel processes. And what that suggests to me, in terms of something like free will, for example, is that free will comes out of on the roof. But free will seems to come out of that for me. You know, if we have this set of processes by which this simple subroutine we call a self, or a proto or a core self, probes the multiple data streams of information and perceptions and memories that are happening to us, and draws out this single strand of and constructs effectively by drawing out this single strand of our autobiography. We can then use that to project into the future, don't we? We call this we call this us, we call it me, this autobiographical combination of a core self wrapped up in an autobiographical self. We imagine that strand projected into the future, and we can imagine it projected into multiple different futures. But that imagined projection into multiple different futures that we could potentially use our free will to choose between, that's again an artifact of the illusion of a coherent single thread drawn out of the chemical soup of multiple data strands, to mix the metaphor. That's, at least in the theories that I'm talking about, that's not how the consciousness works. That's not how the brain works. It's not how the body works in relation to the brain, and it is, as I say, it's something of an illusion. So free will is an artifact produced by the illusionary nature of a single consciousness, a single agency. When there is no agency in there, really. It's just a subroutine built on the back of body-brain processes which interrogate, search this database and produce this illusion of a single self projected into multiple but ultimately illusory futures. I hope that makes some kind of sense.